Well, joining me now, Executive Director at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Peter Jennings. Pete, what did you make of today's National Press Club speech?
Well, in some ways it was the smiling face of Chinese diplomacy rather than the wolf warrior aggression that we've heard in recent years, Peter, but it doesn't really make much difference. The thing to do is judge the People's Republic of China by its actions. So, you know, when Minister Wang talks about a relationship that's marked by respect, goodwill, fairness and vision, I know he's not talking about the current state of Australia PRC relations. And indeed, none of those words really describe a Communist Party which is engaging in wholesale cyber spying on Australian institutions, which is seeking to strip intellectual property out of Australian universities, and which gets instantly critical of Australia the second we deviate from a position that China does not like. I think that, you know, judge them by their actions rather than by their words is how I describe the current state of Australia's relations with China.
Peter, I thought it was an insult to our intelligence. How can we engage in diplomacy? How can we engage in meaningful dialogue with these people when our senior cabinet ministers pick up the phone to talk to their compatriots in Beijing and they won't answer the calls?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And indeed, the funny thing that's happening about the Communist Party's approach right now is that they seem to have got themselves to a position where unless you are 100% aligned with their views, then all you're going to get is criticism in return. And I thought that came out actually in the Q&A to Minister Wang's speech today. So again, we're having this denial that the virus has anything to do with China. You know, Gleeson, I'm here to tell you it did not originate in Wollongong, right? And so to have to pretend that what we've got here is some, you know, bizarre reaction on the part of the Western world, which has hurt the feelings of the Chinese people. What nonsense. You know, what the Chinese Communist Party is doing is scrambling as hard as it can to remove itself from the failures of its mismanagement of the virus in January and February of this year, about which the Chinese people were actually extremely unimpressed. You know, so again, I would just make the point that it's all very well for the press club to host a deputy from the Chinese embassy, but what we really need to be doing is actually understanding China by its actions rather than words, whether they're the nice words of China's peaceful rise, which we've all been lulled into, or indeed the aggressive words of wolf warrior diplomacy, which has been the new style of Chinese diplomacy in the last few months. Just judge the Communist Party by its actions. That's the smarter thing to do.
Well, and some of the comments were quite extraordinary, you know, that Australia had hurt the feelings of the Chinese by having the audacity to, you know, champion an independent inquiry into the origins of this particular virus. And I think you nailed it quite eloquently, Peter Jennings, when you said it didn't come out of Wollongong. Well, we know it came out of somewhere. But let's find out. If it did come out of Wollongong, well, maybe this independent inquiry will establish that, and Australia will get on with the job of making sure it doesn't happen again, because that's the key here. This is about humanity and not about hurting someone's feelings. I mean, what about the feelings of the people throughout the world whose parents, whose sons, whose daughters have died as a result of this virus?
Yeah, almost 700,000 people now. This phrase, hurt the feelings of the Chinese people, is an interesting one, Peter. It gets used quite often. And what's actually going on here is that the Communist Party is trying to create a narrative which says that the party is the people and the people are the party. And if you say anything which is nasty about the party, critical, for example, of the party's mismanagement of the virus, then you are insulting the Chinese people. It's just propaganda and rhetoric. And of course, it just shows you that although there were lots of nice words about, you know, the strategic relationship that we're supposed to have with China, as soon as a question arises, which is something that is, you know, difficult for the party to handle, we're back into this tough language of, oh, Australia, you're hurting the feelings of the Chinese people. It is just propaganda, Gleeson, and we need to stop taking it at face value and realise what it is that's actually being served up to us.
It was interesting that the menu today was included meat, wine and barley, which of course are the three areas of our trade that the Chinese have imposed sanctions on. Just before we go, Peter, what about our diversification away from the Chinese and weaning ourselves off the Chinese yuan in many respects, particularly not just trade, but also education? There's a lot of debate at the moment about the Chinese infiltration of our tertiary education system. Is there a way we can do that, or are we so inextricably linked to the Chinese in these areas that it would be almost impossible?
There's always a way, Glee. So, I think we just have to start on it. Another great myth is that it's just impossible, so let's not try. On the university question, I think the universities are terribly culpable here for, in quest of research dollars, simply refusing to do due diligence to find out who their academics might also be receiving a second salary from, as the Australian reported so well over the last few days. I think Josh Frydenberg is also really worthy of a pat on the back here for going against the Treasury's advice to say that it's not in Australia's strategic interests to allow another major dairy operation to be taken over by a Chinese company with links back to state-owned companies. Any business that right now thinks it's a good idea to build more dependence on China really should be having its head read. We've just got to get out of this idea that somehow we're all going to snap back to a happy relationship. This is a different China, a more aggressive China. And the right approach for our government and for universities and the business sector is now to diversify as hard as we can to find alternate markets to reduce this vulnerability to coercion. And we've seen from China that is exactly what they will do. If they don't like what we think and say, then coercion is the next step for them. So let's reduce that vulnerability if we can.
Peter Jennings, always a pleasure to see you on the show. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Peter. My pleasure.